So we're beginning chapter 5 of Lord of the Flies, Beast from Water, and we are observing Ralph as our protagonist grow as a character. So the debacle of the end of chapter 4 is that Jack decided to take all the hunters. He prioritized hunting away from the fire. The fire, as a signal to the civilized world, was let go, and a ship went by. So Ralph is really exerting his headship as the chosen leader of this group. And I've highlighted for us in our PDF here some observations of how Ralph is growing as a character. So this is loss of innocence. He can't be the boy doing a cartwheel or standing on his head in excitement. He has to become a leader. I'd also like you to observe, as I've underlined, how Piggy, who can think like a leader, who is more mature, is not fit to be a leader. So interesting observations. Let's start our audio and you can follow along.
Chapter 5, Beast from Water. The tide was coming in, and there was only a narrow strip of firm beach between the water and the white stumbling stuff near the palm terrace. Ralph chose the firm strip as a path because he needed to think, and only here could he allow his feet to move without having to watch them. Suddenly, pacing by the water, he was overcome with astonishment. He found himself understanding the wearisomeness of this life, where every path was an improvisation, and a considerable part of one's waking life was spent watching one's feet. He stopped, facing the strip, and remembering the first enthusiastic exploration as though it were part of a brighter childhood, he smiled jeeringly. He turned then and walked back toward the platform with the sun in his face. The time had come for the assembly, and as he walked into the concealing splendors of the sunlight, he went carefully over the points of his speech. There must be no mistake about this assembly, no chasing imaginary. He lost himself in a maze of thoughts that were rendered vague by his lack of words to express them. Frowning, he tried again. This meeting must not be fun, but business. At that he walked faster, aware all at once of urgency and the declining sun, and a little wind created by his speed that breathed about his face. This wind pressed his gray shirt against his chest so that he noticed, in this new mood of comprehension, how the folds were stiff like cardboard and unpleasant. Noticed, too, how the frayed edges of his shorts were making an uncomfortable pink area on the front of his thighs. With a convulsion of the mind, Ralph discovered dirt and decay, understood how much he disliked perpetually flicking the tangled hair out of his eyes, and at last, when the sun was gone, rolling noisily to rest among dry leaves. At that he began to trot. The beach near the bathing pool was dotted with groups of boys waiting for the assembly. They made way for him silently, conscious of his grim mood and the fault at the fire. The place of assembly in which he stood was roughly a triangle, but irregular and sketchy, like everything they made. First there was the log on which he himself sat, a dead tree that must have been quite exceptionally big for the platform. Perhaps one of those legendary storms of the Pacific had shifted it here. This palm trunk lay parallel to the beach, so that when Ralph sat he faced the island, but to the boys was a darkish figure against the shimmer of the lagoon. The two sides of the triangle of which the log was based were less evenly defined. On the right was a log polished by restless seats along the top, but not so large as the chief's and not so comfortable. On the left were 4 small logs, one of them, the farthest, lamentably springy. Assembly after assembly had broken up in laughter when someone had leaned too far back and the log had whipped and thrown half a dozen boys backwards into the grass. Yet now he saw no one had had the wit, not himself, nor Jack, nor Piggy, to bring a stone and wedge the thing. So they would continue enduring the ill-balanced twister because... Again he lost himself in deep waters. Grass was worn away in front of each trunk, but grew tall and untrodden in the center of the triangle. Then, at the apex, the grass was thick again because no one sat there. All round the place of assembly the gray trunks rose, straight or leaning, and supported the low roof of leaves. On 2 sides was the beach, behind, the lagoon, in front, the darkness of the island. Ralph turned to the chief's seat. They had never had an assembly as late before. That was why the place looked so different. Normally, the underside of the green roof was lit by a tangle of golden reflections, and their faces were lit upside down, like, thought Ralph, when you hold an electric torch in your hands. But now the sun was slanting in at one side, so that the shadows were where they ought to be. Again he fell into that strange mood of speculation that was so foreign to him. If faces were different when lit from above or below, what was a face? What was anything? Ralph moved impatiently. The trouble was, if you were a chief, you had to think, you had to be wise. And then the occasion slipped by you so that you had to grab at a decision. This made you think, because thought was a valuable thing that got results. Only, decided Ralph as he faced the chief's seat, I can't think, not like Piggy. Once more that evening Ralph had to adjust his values. Piggy could think. He could go step by step inside that fat head of his, only Piggy was no chief. But Piggy, for all his ludicrous body, had brains. Ralph was a specialist in thought now, and could recognize thought in another. The sun in his eyes reminded him how time was passing, so he took the conch down from the tree and examined the surface. Exposure to the air had bleached the yellow and pink to near white, and transparency. Ralph felt a kind of affectionate reverence for the conch, even though he had fished the thing out of the lagoon himself. He faced the place of assembly and put the conch to his lips. The others were waiting for this and came straight away. Those who were aware that a ship had passed the island while the fire was out were subdued by the thought of Ralph's anger, while those, including the little ones who did not know, were impressed by the general air of solemnity. The place of assembly filled quickly. Jack, Simon, Maurice, most of the hunters on Ralph's right, the rest on the left, under the sun. Piggy came and stood outside the triangle. This indicated that he wished to listen but would not speak, and Piggy intended it as a gesture of disapproval. The thing is, we need an assembly. No one said anything, but the faces turned to Ralph were intent. He flourished the conch. He had learned out of practical business that fundamental statements like this had to be said at least twice before everyone understood them. One had to sit, attracting all eyes to the conch, and drop words like heavy round stones among the little groups that crouched or squatted. He was searching his mind for simple words that even the little ones would understand what the assembly was about. Later, perhaps, practiced debaters, Jack, Maurice, Piggy, would use their whole art to twist the meaning. But now, at the beginning, the subject of the debate must be laid out clearly. We need an assembly, not for fun, not for laughing and falling off a log. The group of little ones on the twister giggled and looked at each other. Not for making jokes or for... He lifted the conch in an effort to find the compelling word. For cleverness. Not for these things, but to put things straight. He paused for a moment. I've been alone. By myself I went thinking what's what. I know what we need. An assembly to put things straight, and first of all, I'm speaking. He paused for a moment and automatically pushed back his hair. Piggy tiptoed to the triangle, his ineffectual protest made, and joined the others. Ralph went on. We have lots of assemblies. Everybody enjoys speaking and being together. We decide things, but they don't get done. We were going to have water brought from the stream and lift in those coconut shells under the fresh leaves. So it was for a few days. Now there's no water. The shells are dry. People drink from the river. There was a murmur of assent. Not that there's anything wrong with drinking from the river. I mean, I'd sooner have water from that place, the pool where the waterfall is, than have an old coconut shell. Only we said we'd have the water brought, and now not. There are only 2 full shells there this afternoon. He licked his lips. Then there's the huts, shelters. The murmur swelled again and died away. You mostly sleep in shelters. Tonight, except for Sam and Eric up by the fire, you all sleep there. Who built the shelters? Clamor rose at once. Everyone had built the shelters. Ralph had to wave the conch once more. Wait a minute. I mean, who built all 3? We all built the first one. 4 of us the second one, and me and Simon built the last one over there. That's why it's so tottery. No, don't laugh. That shelter might fall down if the rain comes back. We'll need those shelters then. He paused and cleared his throat. There's another thing. We chose those rocks right along beyond the bathing pool as a lavatory. That was sensible, too. The tide cleans the place up. You little uns know about that. There were sniggers here and there and swift glances. Now people seem to use anywhere, even near the shelters and the platform. You little uns, when you're getting fruit, if you're taking short. The assembly roared. I said if you're taking short, you keep away from the fruit. That's dirty. Laughter rose again. I said that's dirty. He plucked at his stiff gray shirt. That's really dirty. If you're taking short, you go right along the beach to the rocks. See? Piggy held out his hands for the conch, but Ralph shook his head. His speech was planned, point by point. We've all got to use the rocks again. This place is getting dirty. He paused. The assembly, sensing a crisis, was tensely expectant. And then, about the fire. Ralph let out a spare breath with a little gasp that was echoed by his audience. Jack started to chip a piece of wood with his knife and whispered something to Robert, who looked away. The fire is the most important thing on the island. How can we ever be rescued except by luck if we don't keep a fire going? Is a fire too much for us to make? He flung out his arm. Look at us. How many are we? And yet we can't keep a fire going to make smoke? Don't you understand? Can't you see we ought to die before we let the fire out? There was a self-conscious giggling among the hunters. Ralph turned on them passionately. You hunters, you can laugh, but I tell you the smoke is more important than the pig. However often you kill one. Do all of you see? He spread his arms wide and turned to the whole triangle. We've got to make smoke up there, or die. He paused, feeling for his next point. And another thing, someone called out. Too many things. There came a mutter of agreement. Ralph overrode them. And another thing, we nearly set the whole island on fire, and we waste time rolling rocks and making little cooking fires. Now I say this, and I make it a rule because I'm chief. We won't have a fire anywhere but on the mountain, ever. There was a row immediately. Boys stood up and shouted, and Ralph shouted back. Because if you want a fire to cook fish or crab, you can jolly well go up the mountain. That way we'll be certain. Hands were reaching for the conch in the light of the setting sun. He held on and leapt on the trunk. All this I meant to say. Now I've said it. You voted me for chief. Now, you do what I say. They quieted, slowly. At last were seated again. Ralph dropped down and spoke in his ordinary voice. So remember, the rocks for the lavatory, keep the fire going, and smoke showing as a signal. Don't take the fire from the mountain. Take your food up there. Jack stood up, scowling in the gloom, and held out his hands. I haven't finished yet. But you've talked and talked. I've got the conch. Jack sat down, grumbling. Then the last thing. This is what people can talk about. He waited till the platform was very still. Things are breaking up. I don't understand why. We began well, we were happy, and then... He moved the conch gently, looking beyond them at nothing, remembering the beastie, the snake, the fire, the talk of fear. Then people started getting frightened. A murmur, almost a moan, rose and passed away. Jack had stopped whittling. Ralph went on abruptly. But that's little un's talk. We'll get that straight. So the last part, the bit that we can all talk about, is kind of deciding on the fear. The hair was creeping into his eyes again. We've got to talk about this fear and decide there's nothing in it. I'm frightened myself sometimes, only that's nonsense, like bogies. Then, when we've decided, we can start again and be careful about things like the fire. A picture of 3 boys walking along the bright beach flitted through his mind. And be happy. Ceremonially, Ralph laid the conch on the trunk beside him as a sign that the speech was over. What sunlight reached them was level. Jack stood up and took the conch.
Okay, so that is Ralph's speech, and he lays down some rules. So he's really exercising his headship, and we want to see how it's going to go. We also know that Jack is going to pick up the conch right now, and he has something to say. So we want to find that out. And of course, Piggy has something to say. And I'm going to prelude all of this that this week and with this chapter 5, we're also going to set up a Freudian reading of this text. And Jack, Ralph, and Piggy are all going to stand for different parts of what Freud considered the mind, the id, the ego, and the superego. You will learn about this week. But for today, we're going to keep our audio and our video between 15 and 17 minutes. So that is it for our reading for today.